This is Nicholas Birns, and I'm talking to you today about Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy. I'm very sad not to be there with you in person. I always enjoy every year visiting you and your wonderful teacher, E.A. Cho, and talking about taking this wonderful story, Alyosha the Pot, and illustrating it, making it into visual art. This year, alas, schedule complexities precluded this, but I'm coming to you through the magic of video. Tolstoy would have hated this. He would have hated technology intruding. He would have wanted me to be there face-to-face with you, talking about his story, but sometimes we have to resort to the second best. I'm going to talk a bit about the man, and then we'll go into the story. Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy. Let's look at the name. Lev is the same as Leo in English, Greco-Roman for lion. And Leo Tolstoy, Lev Tolstoy, had the ferocity of a lion. Lev also means heart in Hebrew, and Tolstoy, of course, had a big heart, as we see in this story. Nikolaevich, that means son of Nikolai. That's called a patronymic. And in Russian, you always bear your father's name all your life. If you're a girl, a daughter of Nikolai, you're Nikolaevna, like Anna Nikolaevna. I would be, since my father's name was Lawrence, I would be Nikolai Lavrentovich, since Lavrenti is Lawrence in Russian. You had your father's name with you your entire life. That testified to the power of the father. And we see the power of the father in this story. When Alyosha's father does not want him to marry Ustinia, Alyosha takes that as the final word. The power of the father is listened to. And so, that Nikolaevich is very indicative of that. Now, Tolstoy was a very old name. It's a very distinguished name. You see the Tolstoys mentioned in the 17th century along with the other great aristocratic families of that day, the Golitsins and the Dolgorukis and the Narishkins and the Miloslavskis and the big families that were kind of 1 degree below the emperor, the Tsar. And he was born to both status and money. And he had a large estate called Yasnaya Polyana. And he was a count, a Graf, as they would say in German. He was a member of the titled nobility. But the remarkable thing about Tolstoy is he rejected all that. And he took everything he had and pretty much said it didn't matter anything to him. What mattered was the basic tenets of Christianity, the simple life, and above all, doing good for others. He was born in 1828. In the early 1850s, he served very importantly as a soldier in the Caucasus, which are the mountains separating Russia from the Middle East. And a lot of the people, not all of them, but a lot of the people in the Caucasus are Muslim. And Tolstoy encountered the Muslim world there, and that bore fruit in his great late story, Haji Murad, which he wrote just before he wrote Alyosha the Pot. Tolstoy also, where he lived in Yasnaya Polyana, was in the Tula district, which is a few hours east of Moscow, and it is kind of on the east side of European Russia. And Tolstoy always had this link to the east. He went to Kazan University, where Lenin, the Soviet revolutionary leader, also later went. And that's interesting because Kazan, where the university was located, was occupied in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries by the Mongolians, by the Golden Horde, who were the remnant of, from when Genghis Khan had conquered that area in the early 13th century. And so there's this eastern side, and Tolstoy was very interested in Buddhism, very interested in Asian religion, never totally approvingly. He's skeptical about it in the end, but he had the interest. And very importantly, Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, the great Indian nonviolent resistor and independence leader, read Tolstoy very avidly and got a lot of his ideas about how to resist oppression without being violent, got a lot of his ideas from Tolstoy, and they had a brief correspondence towards the end of Tolstoy's life. So Tolstoy is a world figure. There are statues to him all over the world. He's a figure in world culture. He doesn't just belong to Russia or even to the West. He's somebody who is part of the inheritance of thinking, morally reflective people worldwide. Tolstoy wrote two very famous novels. One was called War and Peace, Vojna i Mir in Russian. And War and Peace was, for its day, a very experimental novel, since you had pretty much half of it is historical, is more or less expository narrative, laced at the end with some philosophy about about Napoleon's invasion of Russia and the debacle that ensued when the French emperor tried to invade a much larger and colder country and was humiliated. And then the other strand is private life, marriages, loves, deaths, hopes, despairs, personal evolutions, personal turning points. The stuff of soap opera, although written on a very elevated level. And Tolstoy was ingenious in bringing together both the public and the private, the historical and domestic, in fiction. His next novel, Anna Karenina, was also kind of had two major strands, although you didn't have public and private here, but two different kinds of private life. Anna Karenina is an unhappily married woman. She's, in fact, there's a movie coming out shortly, and she's going to be played by Keira Knightley, who earlier played Elizabeth Bennet in the adaptation of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. And you can see Anna Karenina, the character, as kind of what Elizabeth Bennet becomes if she's unhappily married and slightly more middle-aged. And the other strand is about this man, much like Tolstoy. It's Lev Tolstoy, and the character's name is Konstantin Levin. You could hear the Lev. And Konstantin Levin is more happily married, but there are issues in his marriage he has to solve, and he has to think about how to live his life, how a good life should be lived. And Tolstoy himself, in the wake of writing this novel, really began to think about this. And around 1880, he underwent a radical conversion, and he became profoundly Christian, not conventionally Christian. Almost all Russians had to. You had to have belonged to the Orthodox Church, to the Pravoslavnaya Church, as they would call it in Russian. And that church had bishops and cathedrals and hierarchies and icons and liturgies, and Tolstoy wanted none of that. He just wanted to live as Christ taught us in the Gospels, to do unto others as we would have them do unto us, to love the meek, to love the poor, to cherish the simple life, and to live for others. And Tolstoy began systematically trying to do good, and particularly reaching out to the peasants who lived on his estate, to people who lived humble and simple lives, and trying to understand them and make their lives better. And interestingly, there used to be on Russian estates serfs, people, in other words, who were bound to the land, who could not move. In 1861, the best Tsar of the 19th century, Alexander II, freed the serfs. And for a while it looked like liberal reform would take root in Russia. But by 1880, Alexander was assassinated in 1881. That dream began to fade, and the hopes for a liberal Russia, for a Russian spring, as we might say today, very much faded. And Tolstoy thought, we have to have reform of the heart. Political reform isn't enough. Piecemeal liberalization isn't enough. We have to have a radical reform of the heart. And he, at that point, mainly turned to writing nonfiction. Books like What Then Shall We Do? And The Kingdom of God is Within Us. And A Confession, which really was the book where he first bore his soul about the change that had occurred to him. And he wrote very little fiction afterwards, and this story is one of the few pieces of fiction he wrote. Tolstoy became what we would today call a dissident. He was somebody who criticized the government. I've mentioned the idea of the Tsar a couple of times, C-Z-A-R. It's basically the same word as Caesar, as the Roman Caesar, or the German Kaiser. And the Tsar was, to use a word the Russians used, he was an autocrat. He was, I think the Russian word is gasudar. He was self-controlling and controlled everybody else. And his word was law. And when you had a good czar like Alexander II, that was fine. But when you kind of had a very authoritarian czar like his son, or a well-meaning but incompetent czar like his grandson, things really ran amok. And the czarist regime ruled the country with an iron hand. It ruled it fiercely and oppressively. And particular segments of the population were oppressed. The Jews were very much oppressed. And these campaigns called pogroms, P-O-G-R-O-M-S, against the Jews were waged. And that's one of the reasons I'm speaking to, is that my grandmother, Rosa Bromberg, who was a Jew from Odessa, in what is now the Ukraine, her family was harassed to the extent that they had to leave. There were other groups that were pacifists, that didn't want to fight in wars, like the Doukhobors, and Tolstoy stood up for those groups. And Tolstoy said to the Tsarist regime that the means of force and oppression you are using against these people is evil. He did what we would today call, somewhat of a cliche, speaking truth to power. And Tolstoy was very much hated by the government for it. In fact, they would have loved to have thrown him in jail, but he was too wealthy and too famous. He was one of the most famous writers in the world, and he was this wealthy, aristocratic, prestigious man, and they could not do anything to him, which made them even more mad at him. So this story is being written by a very wise man. He is 77 when he writes it, a very old man, a man with a deep distilled wisdom, a man who had thought everything through. And it's interesting in this respect that the story is very simple. And it's an earned simplicity. It's a simplicity that comes at the end of just thinking all of life through and deciding what really matters. The French would call it la simplicité volontaire, a voluntary simplicity. And Tolstoy in his writing very much takes up that voluntary simplicity. Okay, let's talk about Alyosha the pot, the story. It's Alyosha Gorshak in Russian. And he's called the pot, of course, because he breaks a pot of milk, and he's teased by the other kids for it. And it's interesting in that, of course, in breaking a pot, you're taking it out of use. You're destroying its use value. You're taking away its utility. You are making it into something aesthetic, into something whose value is not in its use. And it's interesting when you go to museums and you see these ancient Greek pots or ancient pots from any culture, and you see they used to have a use. Formerly, they had a utility, they had a purpose, but now they're in a museum and they're beautiful art objects to be admired for their aesthetic use. And so Tolstoy, in calling him Alyosha the pot, is saying, you know, his use value doesn't really matter. It's what's in him that matters. It's what's intrinsic that matters. Now, Tolstoy was certainly not an advocate of art for art's sake. He did not gush over beauty. He did not believe that an art which did not somehow have to do with real-life problems was at all worth it, and we'll discuss that when we talk about his views on Shakespeare. But he also saw the difference between inherent value and use value. And Alyosha's relationship to the pot is kind of like a painter like Monet's relationship to the water lilies he paints. You know, the water lilies can't get Monet a job, they can't help his love life, they can't get him status, money, or power. They're there because they're there, and he paints them because they're there, and he wants to show the world that he sees that they're there. There's something intrinsic in that. And so Alyosha breaking the pot puts him into the realm that is beyond utility. And we'll talk about that a bit later when we talk about his love for Justinia. Ustinia, as they would say in Russian. On the other hand, Alyosha is very useful around the house. He does a lot of useful things. And although he's gawky and thin and awkward, and he can't be a soldier, unlike the older brother, and he can't, obviously doesn't have the smarts to be a lawyer or a doctor or be sent to the court to be an official in the Tsar's court, and he's the kind of kid in the family that his parents are always asking, what are we going to do with him? What are we going to do with this kid? And every family has one child where they ask that question of. But Alyosha has, as the story says, a knack for doing things. He could clean the house. He could ride the horses. He could wipe the snow off the roof. He can cart things around. He could polish boots. And he's very hardworking. He may not have a lot of strength, but his work ethic is very good. And for that reason, people who kind of laugh at him at first, they end up admiring him. And people who think he's not important end up valuing him. And so the father sends him to the merchant's family. And again, he fits in surprisingly well in the merchant's family. And makes himself useful, even though, again, he's a kind of a weird-looking guy, and maybe even a weird-acting guy. There he meets Ustinia. And he has this wonderful feeling. Of course, he's felt loved by his mother. And he always feels loved and accepted by his mother. But that's a given. Your mother's love is a given. I have these birds behind me that you might have been hearing while I've been talking to you. And I assume one doesn't know what goes on in their heads. Tolstoy once wrote a story called Hostelmare from the viewpoint of a horse, so we might be interested in writing a story from the viewpoint of Australian parakeets like I have behind me. But you don't know what goes on in their heads, but I assume that they've taken whatever is in their... They've taken it as part of their world. There's nothing that's really surprising. In human life, there's this wonderful moment described in the story where you feel that somebody else, who's not your mother, who's not inherently part of your life, cares about you, again, intrinsically for what you are. And she loves him and he loves her for what they are. Again, not because they could do anything for each other. And it's this wonderfully humble courtship. They fall in love while feeding each other porridge and laughing. And he liked listening to her and she liked listening to him. It's not that they talked about anything important or big. They just like that mutuality and being with each other. And he finds love. And I see this story as Tolstoy's response to Romeo and Juliet. Because it's a very similar situation. A young boy and young girl fall in love, and the parents are opposed to it. And it doesn't come about because the parents are opposed to it. There are a couple of things, though, that are very different. Romeo and Juliet are aristocrats, and they write to each other in highfalutin sonnets, and they act as if all the things Tolstoy had disdained, the trappings of wealth, status, power, and of eloquent language, official language, is important. These people are humble, they don't have to talk about anything, the love is enough. Very importantly, whereas Romeo and Juliet both die tragically, Ustinia lives, and Alyosha gives her up because his father tells him to. And whereas Romeo rebels against the injustice of the world that is conspiring to prevent him from having Juliet, Alyosha accepts it. He accepts everything. He says, I understand. And it's almost superhuman. I think many of us would bridle with resentment if, we were underestimated, nobody thought we were important, nobody really valued us, and then finally we were forbidden to love who we loved. Most of us would be resentful. I mean, I think we could look at ourselves and we would all be pretty resentful. But Alyosha isn't. He says, this is what is, and I will accept what is, and I will do the best I can with it. And it's because of that whereas Juliet dies, Ustinia lives. She's still alive in the story. She's still there. And there's that wonderful moment where he says it's kind of better that we weren't married because we could be friends now. And Tolstoy, who, his wife he had married this younger woman who had married this famous writer, and then he converted to being this kind of prophet of the simple life, and his wife kind of resented it. And he's probably talking in a way about his own marriage there. But it's a very touching moment in the story where it's precisely because Alyosha does not insist on his love for Ustinia above all else that it's able to happen. That they're able to be together at the end. It's interesting that this occurs at Shrovetide, Shrove Tuesday, like Mardi Gras just before Lent, the most celebratory part of the year before people give up things for Lent in the Christian calendar. Of course, Russians go overboard. They have, I think, a week of Shrovetide, and then Lent they give up even more. And then on Easter, after, they stay up all night, and then drink vodka and have herring or whatever the kind of stuff they eat after the rising of Christ is proclaimed on Easter. But it's as if the love for Astynia is the Shrovetide, and then it goes into the Lent of the hard times of his death. But the love that he continues to have keeps him going, and his knowledge that he's acted ethically with regard to that love. The death of Alyosha. Tolstoy, throughout his work, and his great story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, particularly, but we see it also in War and Peace. We see it in Anna Karenina. There's important deaths in all those stories. Tolstoy insisted on the importance of death in human life. Today we try to cordon off death. Today we try to medicalize death and make it clinical. Today we're rather ashamed of death. Death is in a separate place. A funeral is not part of life for us. A funeral is an interruption. In more traditional societies, and Tolstoy is in a very interesting position because he loves modernity for what it can do for human dignity and for the promise of individual dignity for everybody. But he is, as I said before, mistrustful of technology and of improvement that is merely acceleration. And he would say that modern technology has in many ways distanced ourselves from the reality of death. And that in the old days, and in all cultures worldwide, all traditional cultures, when people knew somebody was dying, they would all gather at the bed and all say farewell, and they'd be an open celebration of death. It's very interesting today. We're very liberal about sex. Sex is all over. I always say that the kind of sexual references that when I was a kid, you had to stay up till 10 p.m. after the kid's bedtime to see. They're now on at 7:30 on television. Sex is universal. Death is not talked about. It's the reverse of the 19th century when nobody talked about sex, but death was something accepted. Death was something that people were intimate with. And Alyosha is not afraid of death. And when he falls off the roof, he's cleaning off the snow, he realizes he's going to die, but he accepts it. And again, other people would be resentful that I haven't had enough of a life. I haven't done anything. I'm only a young man. How unfair life is. But Alyosha says, well, I accept it. And when you think about it, he has reason to. And here we kind of get back to Romeo. When the Romeo died, he did get to do the most important thing, which is love. There's nothing more important than loving. And incidentally, the outcome is not unimportant in love. The outcome is an important secondary objective, but love is far more important than the outcome. It's loving somebody. It's not whether you possess them or not. And Alyosha has similarly had the greatest human experience of loving and being loved. And you can't beat that whether you live 85 years or 21 years. Similarly, Alyosha has been a good son. He has honored his mother and father. He has done his best to please them. He has pleased his boss. He has worked hard. Whenever he's asked to do anything, he has done so to the best of his ability. He's had a short life, but he hasn't been cheated in life. And that is, I think, the genesis of that great moment of wonder, of surprise at the end, where he's on the threshold of death, and he suddenly sees the surprise. And, of course, this is the one thing. Tolstoy was a wise man who knew and had thought about nearly everything, but this is the one thing he didn't know about. Death. We can't know about death until we die. There's a younger contemporary of Tolstoy, Jack London, an American writer, who I believe is rather well known in Russia, or was at least during the Soviet period. And Jack London, at the end of a story of his called Martin Eden, has this is a spoiler alert, has the character die, and the last words of the novel are, quote, at the moment that he knew, he ceased to know, close quote. He stopped knowing. And of course, the moment we know anything about death, we can't know anything because we die. But you picture Alyosha seeing, maybe that his life had gotten him into heaven. That his life had earned him something wonderful in death. Because he wasn't famous. Totally unlike his creator, he never wrote a book, nobody ever heard of him, nobody ever was in awe of him. But his life mattered. His life was moral. because, again, he lived it intrinsically. He lived it for himself, for itself. Not for himself, but for itself. He didn't ask to get anything out of it. He didn't demand anything of life. He accepted. He accepted. And that's what Tolstoy admires so much about him. I really wish that I could exchange ideas with you and talk about your feelings about this story. And I really would encourage you. Your teacher has my email, and I could give it to you also, birnsn@newschool.edu. I would love to hear from you, and I would love to see your work inspired by this story. And I'm very glad to have had the chance to visit with you today and talk about this story by probably one of the 10 greatest writers that ever lived. And you're reading one of his very finest stories and getting to illustrate it, and I can't think of anything better than that. Goodbye, and have a good rest of the class.